Ahsoka Season 1 was so close to being great. As someone who's currently been studying Star Wars with videos on all its movies and shows, why do I feel Ahsoka fell just short of greatness? In this video, I will discuss what caused Ahsoka to fall short of greatness, what the show did really well, what the show did poorly, and what its impact will be on the future of the franchise, for both good and bad. Let's begin! To begin this discussion of Ahsoka, I wanted to start at the beginning. The title of this section of the video suggests episodes 1, 2, and 3, but the beginning really is with what precedes the show, and that's Filoni's work in animation. The biggest topic of debate with Ahsoka has to do with the seemingly pre-required viewing of the Clone Wars and Rebels to understand the series completely. Almost every main character and villain in this series are pre-existing characters, but more importantly, there are pre-existing relationships and motivations that the storytellers need to convey. Now sure, at this point we had seen Ahsoka in 2 episodes of live-action TV, so you could argue the audience is somewhat familiar with her, but as we'll see in a second, the whole crux of Ahsoka's arc has to do with Anakin, and her relationship with Anakin was only briefly hinted at in the most vague terms in her last 2 live-action appearances. Now the reason I find this to be such an important topic to discuss is not simply that newer viewers won't understand what's going on, but that they don't feel the emotional context of what's going on. The entire plot of this show is preventing the return of Thrawn. This is said in the first paragraph of the opening crawl. The casual viewer doesn't need to know who Thrawn is to understand that he's a threat and that he needs to remain in exile. But what they don't understand is why he's such a threat. Rebels fans know he's a tactical genius who has a mind like no other, but for 5 episodes of the season, new viewers don't understand that. Another example would be arguably the B-plot of the series, getting Ezra home. The casual viewer understands that there's this guy in exile that was close to our main characters and they want to bring him home, but what they don't feel is the emotional connection between our characters and Ezra. One of the biggest moments of the season is when Sabine risks the fate of the galaxy to go see her friend again. All season, however, we are just told how important Ezra is to her, but we hadn't even got a glimpse of what the relationship was like up to that point. Most viewers hadn't seen the two progressively become close to each other over 4 seasons of Rebels, and this dilemma is what makes dissecting the show so difficult, because frankly we need to analyze it from 2 perspectives, those who have seen the animated shows and those who haven't. Many would argue that the animated shows should not be required viewing, and therefore I should discuss the show as if the Clone Wars and Rebels don't exist, and that's fair, but what I also keep getting back to is the MCU. Avengers Endgame was not simply the 4th movie in the Avengers franchise, it was the 22nd movie in the MCU. The MCU is full of pre-required viewing. If you were to just watch the Captain America trilogy, you would be missing out on so much because you hadn't seen the Avengers films. Frankly, you can't watch Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 without having seen the Avengers films because one of the main characters in Gamora dies in Infinity War. But at the time, at least before Phase 4, the MCU was praised for this because it was bringing serialized storytelling to the big screen. No one criticized Infinity War and Endgame for needing pre-required viewing to understand the movies. It was kinda just accepted. So what's the difference between that and what Ahsoka is trying to do? Is it because the pre-required viewing is animation and most people subconsciously view animation as a lesser form of storytelling? Is it because the MCU brought serialized storytelling to the big screen while Disney Plus is bringing serialized storytelling to a TV series, which is already supposed to be serialized storytelling? Well, that's up for you to decide, I suppose. Now, I don't want to spend the whole video discussing this point. Frankly, after episode 3, nothing is going to change for you. You're either invested with or without the animated shows, or you're not. This series does plenty of things well and poorly whether you have seen the animated shows. What I will discuss though is one change I feel would greatly help people who haven't seen the animated shows. And this one change is simply beginning the show with the ending of Rebels. If you go on YouTube right now and look up Ezra Saves Lothal, there is a roughly 2-minute video video from Disney XD showing the moment Ezra sacrificed himself to defeat Thrawn. If you take this exact video and adapt it into live action with all the actors we see throughout the rest of the series, that provides wonders of more context to the rest of the show. Just show this scene, and once the ship jumps to hyperspace, say 10 years later, and play the opening crawl. Here's what adding this scene into the beginning of the show accomplishes. 1. Explaining why Ezra and Thrawn are missing. This show on multiple occasions just says Ezra and Thrawn are missing and that they are together, but they never explain why they are missing or how it happened. Sabine makes one offhanded comment saying she hasn't seen the whales since Ezra disappeared, but that doesn't paint the whole picture as to what actually happened. By showing the ending of Rebels, you don't need any exposition to explain why Thrawn and Ezra can't be found. We saw it, and showing is always better than telling. 2. More context when we see the Purrgil. In the 3rd episode, when the whales show up and Sabine and Ahsoka are in awe, Rebels fans know the significance of the whales. The casual viewers are like, oh, whales that can fly, cool. Showing the whales from the end of Rebels also helps viewers understand how Ahsoka thought to use the whales to go to Peridea in episode 5, because currently it kinda just comes out of nowhere. Sure, Huyang made one comment in episode 3 about using the Purrgil as hyperspace whales, but that one line of dialogue probably went over most people's heads. If we have the ending of Rebels in the beginning of this series, when Ahsoka looks up into the sky and sees the whales, we know exactly what she is thinking. 3. We see the relationship between Ezra and our main characters. One important rule of storytelling is that you can't just tell your audience to feel an emotion. You have to do the groundwork to evoke that emotion in your audience. Character relationships are entirely built on emotion. You can't just tell the audience that two people like each other. If we actually see Hera and Sabine plead with Ezra to get off the Star Destroyer, then we see how important Ezra is to them, because currently to begin the story, we are just told many times how much they care about Ezra. Even a 2-minute scene adds so much more emotional investment. Imagine watching Batman Begins, but the movie doesn't begin with showing the death of Bruce Wayne's parents. It's just something that is alluded to throughout the whole movie. This would drastically change the movie because actually seeing the moment his parents die on screen provides so much more emotional context for the rest of the movie. Another example would be with Inglourious Basterds. Imagine if this same movie existed but you didn't have the opening scene of Hans Landa interrogating this guy and killing Shoshana's whole family. That opening scene is so crucial to the rest of the story. Imagine if The Last of Us never had the opening scene where Joel's daughter dies right in front of him. The reason prologues exist is because it's more important to the rest of the story that we see what happened in the past instead of having the characters just reference it on a few occasions. That's why I feel having this 2-minute prologue just retelling the ending of Rebels would have been so beneficial to the casual viewers. But enough with discussing hypothetical prologues. Let's discuss the actual contents of this show and what makes it so close to being great. The heart of this show is, of course, the relationship between Sabine and Ahsoka. Both characters go on an arc where by the end of the series, they have a stronger master and apprentice bond. So how did that arc begin with these first 3 episodes? And this is where the series is only so close to being great instead of actually being great. When I look at the entire picture of the arcs these characters went on, I really like it, but the way it was told was so disorganized. We begin the series in a peculiar state. We are informed that Ahsoka had already tried to train Sabine, but ultimately the two had a falling out and they hadn't seen each other in years. What was so peculiar about this decision was that it left even the viewers of the animated shows in the dark. Ahsoka and Sabine not once spoke to each other in Rebels. They were in the same room a few times in which both spoke to a wider group, but the two never had a conversation with each other. So even though Ahsoka Tano and Sabine Wren are two already well-developed characters with rich backstories and personalities, there is no existing relationship between the two. This makes the start of the show a little puzzling. To add on to that, we don't get concrete answers as to how these two got acquainted with each other or why it didn't work out until the last episode. We're kinda just left to assume that it didn't work out because Ahsoka doesn't get along with Sabine. This I feel was a problematic start to beginning Ahsoka's arc, and here's why. The series clearly begins with Ahsoka in a flawed state. She seems emotionally distant from everyone, and frankly, she's a jerk to Sabine. She doesn't trust her at all, she feels Sabine does more harm than good, and it appears she doesn't even like Sabine. Many fans in the beginning of the series pointed out that Ahsoka was out of character. She had none of that charm that the animated version of the character had, and people even criticized Rosario Dawson's acting for being flat. Of course, in hindsight, we know that this was intentional. The lingering feelings she had towards Anakin and her fear that Sabine wanted to be a Jedi for the wrong reasons is what led her to being this lifeless, emotionless person. When writing a character arc where your character begins the story in a rather unlikable state, you can't just show the audience that your character is flawed. You need to show them why they are flawed. And we don't get that with Ahsoka until the second half of the series. This just leads to most people being forced to speculate why Ahsoka is like this, which is what us Star Wars fans were doing. Again, the reasons the show gives us for Ahsoka being flawed I found to be excellent reasons, but you need to convey that earlier in the story, leaving the viewers in the dark for most of the season as to why there's such tension between Ahsoka and Sabine was a poor decision. It's an unnecessary mystery that was added to the show. Now, I always want to be careful when I suggest rewrites to a story, because it's important that I don't just rewrite the story to what I would have wanted to see. I need to see what the writers were going for and suggest small changes that would have benefited their story and their goals. So this is what I feel would have accomplished that. Instead of this backstory where Ahsoka struggled to train Sabine and the two had a falling out, have that story play out in real time. The season begins with Ahsoka and Sabine barely knowing each other. In Rebels, they never spoke to each other, so we're going to begin the series with that remaining the case. Ahsoka finds the map, and Hera suggests that Ahsoka go to Sabine for help. When Sabine and Ahsoka meet up halfway through the first episode, it's really the first time they've ever interacted with each other. When Ahsoka tells Sabine that they have a chance to go save Ezra, her strong desire to find her long-lost friend is what leads to Sabine asking if she can train to be a Jedi. It doesn't have to be right in the first episode, but maybe the beginning of the second episode would begin with Sabine having a dream of her entire family dying on Mandalore, and we get the vibe that Sabine wants to learn to wield the Force because she wasn't strong enough to save her family from dying. You know, exactly like Anakin's story. Ahsoka starts to see that Sabine wants to train for the wrong reasons, and that's where the tension between the two begins to grow, because Ahsoka not only doesn't like Sabine's attitude towards becoming a Jedi, but also because Sabine reminds her of Anakin and her place in that legacy of death that she describes. You know how the third episode begins with a training lesson between Ahsoka and Sabine? This could instead be a moment where Sabine gets really angry and frustrated, and this is what starts to scare Ahsoka a bit. And the more Sabine scares Ahsoka, the more she becomes the unlikable person we get in the beginning of the series. So the reasons in my soft rewrite for the tension between Ahsoka and Sabine are the exact same reasons that Filoni conveyed in his already existing story. I just feel my way illustrated that a bit more effectively. Now, just because I think those changes would have made the existing story better, that doesn't mean I dislike what we currently got. Yeah, Ahsoka wasn't like her usual self, but Sabine and Hera were just like the characters I watched in animation. I'm gonna touch on Hera and the New Republic a bit more later, but I want to talk about Sabine and the topic of her being a Jedi because it's quite a controversial one, and I get that. I would have preferred it if Sabine never used the Force and had no desire to become a Jedi. But again, this isn't about the story I would have preferred. I thought they set up Sabine's story here well. Sabine has always been stubborn, and I like how the story didn't put 100% of the blame on her fallout with Ahsoka on Ahsoka. Huyang helps Sabine realize that relationships are a two-way street, and she needs to make the effort too. Anyone who says Sabine is a Mary Sue is an idiot. She'd been training for a long time and had struggled to use the Force all series, and I am so happy that this show reinforced the idea that really anyone can use the Force. Lucas once said, a lot of people get confused about the Force. They see it as some special thing that you can find and pick up and put on your head and suddenly you have the Force. Whereas it's always been designed so that every living being has the Force. The amount of Force, which is like talent or intelligence, is different in every person. Some of it is inherited, but it's no more than a talent. It's not something you can acquire. It's something that you learn to use. Well, why doesn't everyone use the Force then? This is such an idiotic comment. Everyone has the ability to be physically fit and in good health, but not everyone has the discipline to eat right or work out on a consistent basis. The Force is like any skill. For most people, it's not something that you can easily attain. Just like how not everyone out there is skilled enough to be a professional basketball player. Not everyone in the Star Wars galaxy is skilled enough to use the Force. Sabine lacks talent, and that's why after an entire season, all she can do is pull a lightsaber from a few feet away and help a Jedi jump a little bit further. So seeing Sabine go on this journey again was not something I would have done, but I thought it was done well nonetheless. Outside of character stuff, I think where these opening episodes were at their strongest was with their plot direction. Maybe this worked more for me because I know who Thrawn is, but I found the plot to be keeping me more invested earlier on than the characters. But you'd be surprised with how many of these Star Wars shows recently lack direction. Both Mando Season 3 and the Book of Boba Fett had no direction. They They just meandered for the first half of their seasons until we were given a remote hint as to what the season was even about. Giving your story momentum in a TV series is important, because if you don't, then your viewers are going to drop off. So overall, I found the first 3 episodes of the series to be a fine start. It did a decent job introducing the characters, it had some fun action that I enjoyed, especially in episode 3, but with the relationship between Sabine and Ahsoka, I felt it could have done a better job at establishing it. Before I continue on with the rest of this video, only 12.1% of viewers are subscribed to this channel, so if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Episode 4 turned out to be the best episode of the season. Almost everything about this episode works, and it was wonderfully done from start to finish. The episode begins with a fantastic moral dilemma for our characters. Ahsoka poses the possibility to Sabine that they may need to destroy the map if they alone can't have it. As she says, if we can't make the journey to find Ezra, then no one should. Ahsoka specifically asks Sabine if she can count on her, and Sabine says of course she can. What this did was set up a fantastic character moment for Sabine, but more on that later. I also love the moment where Huyang asks the two to stick together. It adds this moment of dread that's gonna come when they inevitably don't stick together. So a countdown timer begins. They must get the map before the Eye of Sion can download the coordinates. It's an easy narrative trick to include a countdown to add more tension to a scene or episode, but the reason it is so common is because it works. There is tension all throughout the episode. Will Ahsoka and Sabine stop Baylan, or will they fail? We get lightsaber fights galore in this episode, and I loved each and every one. I know some people out there complain about these fights and that they're not well choreographed and they're not that well directed either. Sure, I think there could have been a bit more creative camera work, but I'm not going to criticize the choreography. I thought each one of these fights had weight to them, and the atmosphere of CTOS made the fights a lot more visually pleasing. But the highlight of this episode for me was everything with Baylan. I haven't spoken about Baylan and Shin yet, but I really enjoyed their presence in this show. I feel what makes Baylan so interesting is not his backstory or his motivations, but the fact that he's not Jedi or Sith. He's clearly more on the dark side, but he's just a man with his own morals and his own code. Star Wars has always quite been black and white, and I feel where these shows excel is with diving into the gray area, and Baylan is certainly that. I don't want to sound like a Shin hater because I'm not, but I think people vastly overrate her. She's an interesting character that has her own personality and motivations, but that's kinda it. She's nowhere near as three-dimensional as Baylan, and that's fine. Not everyone needs to be the most complex villain or character in the world. I look forward to seeing more of Shin in the future, but for now, she's just fine with great potential. As I said before, the highlight of this episode for me was everything with Baylan, more specifically his fight with Ahsoka. The fight just feels so methodical to me. Baylan at first starts talking about Anakin to try and throw Ahsoka off, then the two face off switching stances until they finally duel. One thing I appreciated was how Baylan is able to physically overpower Ahsoka. Listen, I love The Force Awakens, but I always found it funny how Rey was able to physically overpower Kylo at the end. Adam Driver's a big dude, and if you've watched the animated stuff, you'd know Ahsoka is more of a finesse fighter, so if Ahsoka were to defeat Baylan, she would need to be quick, and ultimately she wasn't. But what I loved even more than this fight was Baylan persuading Sabine to give him the map. Rest in peace, Ray Stevenson, because man, you were phenomenal, especially here. We've gotten plenty of these scenes in Star Wars where the bad guy tries to convince the good guy to join them, and this time they actually did it. What I love about this moment with Sabine is it's a perfect example of an active character making a choice. True character is revealed when they're forced to make tough decisions under pressure. At this point in her life, what does Sabine value more? Her long-lost friend or the state of the galaxy? And she chooses her friend. It was undoubtedly a selfish decision, but it was one that was so human. And even though I wish the revelation had come earlier, killing off Sabine's entire family was such a good choice. It puts into perspective why Sabine would make this decision, because almost everyone she cares about is gone. Sure, Hera and Zeb are still out there, but they're involved in the New Republic right now, and she was just living her lonely life on Lothal. This was a great character moment for Sabine. Now, what I fear may happen in the future is that this plot point is going going to be dropped. When war starts and thousands of people start dying, everyone should be looking at Sabine for who started this. My golden rule of storytelling, for anyone who doesn't know, is that characters must suffer the consequences of their actions. Sabine made a choice, and in future seasons of this show or in other shows, Sabine should face the consequences of that. Now, you may point to Thrawn starting a war and thousands of people dying as the consequence. Consequence in general is not the same as a character facing consequences. Sabine must face a personal consequence, whether that be Ezra dying or people hating her or anything related to her. She needs to be personally affected by the choice she made. And in this series, that doesn't really happen, but I'm going to touch on that in later episodes. Overall, this was a fantastic episode, and probably in my top 5 Mandoverse episodes. The pacing was great, there was gripping tension, and the characters were wonderfully developed with some key choices they made. The episode ends with Ahsoka seeing Anakin again, which transitions us into the next episode. This episode is, of course, the character arc episode. Ahsoka spends half the episode receiving a lesson from Anakin, and the other half showing off her changed self. This is the episode where I am the most conflicted, and it's kind of representative of my feelings about the series as a whole. Ahsoka goes on an arc in this episode, and I really like that arc, but the way Dave presents it is so confusing and so inefficient that I can't help but be frustrated. When this episode first aired, most people were really confused with it. There were countless articles and Reddit posts and videos made trying to explain what Anakin's lesson really was. I would know because I was looking it up too, because even I was confused. Anakin poses this question to Ahsoka, to live or die, and I feel this question Anakin asks is the stem of all the confusion, because my interpretation of this lesson has nothing to do with living or dying. It has to do with Ahsoka coming to terms with her being Anakin's Padawan. In this episode, we learn that the reason Ahsoka has been so emotionally distant and unsupportive of Sabine is because she is haunted by being a part of Anakin's legacy. She idolized her master. She saw him as a perfect Jedi, and she valued his teachings more than almost anything. So when she found out in Rebels that her idol was Darth Vader, she didn't know how to process it. If she based so much of her morals and principles off a guy who turned to the dark side and killed potentially millions of people, then what does that make her? Sabine wanted to become Ahsoka's apprentice. Ahsoka gave herself reasons why she shouldn't do it, like Sabine being motivated by the death of her family. But in reality, she just doesn't want to continue on that legacy of death and destruction. This is what I feel was the point of the 2 flashback scenes. The first was early in the war, and all she is surrounded by is death and pain. Anakin says she has to change with the times and become a soldier, but she doesn't want to be a fighter. She doesn't want to one day train her own Padawan just to fight. The second flashback during the end of the Clone Wars has Anakin telling her he is proud of her for becoming a great warrior and that she's a part of this legacy. Ahsoka asks that if she is everything Anakin was, then that has to include the evil and violent part of Anakin too. So ultimately they fight, and when Ahsoka has the choice to kill this vision of Anakin, I see it as her making a choice not to turn to the dark side, a choice Anakin couldn't refuse. And to me, this was the lesson, that Ahsoka is not Anakin. Anakin did teach her valuable lessons, and he was a good master, but him turning to the dark side doesn't change everything he did for her. Ahsoka coming to terms with this is what allows her to get back to the Ahsoka we all know and love. After this episode, we see Ahsoka talk about Anakin in a more positive light. She mentions to Sabine all the good things Anakin did for her, and when she trains with Anakin, she seems to value his opinions more than she did before. Ahsoka's now not living in fear that she'll turn into Anakin. She's embracing all the valuable lessons he taught her and is ready to be there for Sabine. So on paper, I love this character arc for her. I found it to be a creative direction to take the character after learning Anakin became Vader, but the phrasing of live or die is so confusing to me. I guess it means you either die drowning in the fear that you're like Anakin, or you live your life free of that fear. But see how much explaining I had to do just to justify this arc? And I need to go back to the required viewing of the animated show's discussion. Other aspects of this show, like Ezra and Thrawn, don't require you to watch the animated shows. It just certainly helps if you did. If you have not watched the Clone Wars, then there is no way you should understand understand what this lesson means. You wouldn't know her relationship with Anakin, and you wouldn't know that she learned Anakin was Vader in Rebels. How could you possibly know her flaws stem from her fear of Anakin? So this is why I need to be a little harsh on this episode, because even for animated fans like myself, I was a bit confused. And then thinking about the first half of the season, there is little indication that this is the reason Ahsoka is flawed. I saw a tweet that said Dave Filoni approached the character development in the series with mystery boxes, and I couldn't agree more. I just wish the first half of the season didn't leave us in the dark about why Ahsoka was like this until the 5th episode. This is the core of why the show as a whole fell just short of greatness, because it had great storytelling baked into the season, just told it really poorly and really inefficiently. But at the end of the day, I will always prefer a show or movie that attempts to tell an interesting story and give characters arcs than a show or movie that doesn't do it at all. So when I rewatched this season, and more specifically this episode, I enjoyed it quite a bit because I think I have a good grasp on what Dave was trying to say, but that doesn't mean I don't acknowledge the major faults with it. The rest of the episode I honestly quite loved. The scene with her and the Purrgil felt magical to me. Star Wars hasn't often achieved this magic, but here it did it for me. Also, Jason was surprisingly a highlight of the show. I loved his moments with Chopper and his youthful optimism to become a Jedi. I will say this though, and it's kinda nitpicky, it bothers me that Zeb wasn't here. In The Mandalorian Season 3, I felt like Zeb's inclusion in that one scene was to explain to viewers why he wouldn't be in Ahsoka. But having Carson Teva show up in this episode and not Zeb, the guy he was talking to in the last season, it annoys me. You know what would have been a really good reason to not include Zeb in this show? Just tell the viewers that he has been on Lyrasan this whole time. Say that he would love to be there for Ezra, but he really needed to be there for his people that almost went extinct during the war. That would be a perfectly good reason for Zeb to not be here. But because Zeb is with the New Republic and he's friends with Carson Teva, him not showing up kinda annoys me. I get this is me just being an annoying Rebels fan, but so much of this show is based on our emotional attachment to the animated shows, so it's a little unfair to tell me not to be so attached when it's convenient for the writers. But again, it's a minor thing. Overall, I think this is probably the second best episode of the season, and even though I think Ahsoka's arc was quite confusing, I do like it, and all the scenes with Anakin were well done. Episodes 6 and 7 are the first episodes to take place in the new galaxy on the planet Peridia, and there's a lot to like in these episodes. The highlight for many was Thrawn. His introduction in the 6th episode where he walks out to the organ playing was so perfect, and I love his first line of dialogue.
What was first just a dream has become a frightening reality for those who may oppose us.
I know some people have criticized Filoni's Thrawn for being less three-dimensional than book Thrawn, and I think that's a fair criticism. My only counter is that the Thrawn books take place from his perspective, and the shows don't. It's certainly possible show Thrawn could have similar motives, he just doesn't outright tell the viewers. To move on quickly, I want to touch on a certain aspect about Baylan and Shin's relationship. Baylan has this secret mission that he's keeping secret from the audience all season. What I found to be quite frustrating was that he would never tell Shin his plans. During one of the episodes of the Tatooine Show, this Star Wars podcast I do with me and 3 others, we debated this topic heavily. The points I was making was that Baylan is Shin's master, and they appear to be far closer to each other than, say, a Sith master and apprentice. I find it strange that Baylan wouldn't give Shin a remote clue about what his objectives were. When the two have multiple one-on-one conversations with each other, conversations I find to be really well done, it just appears to me that the reason Baylan isn't telling Shin anything about his plans is because the viewers are watching, so it can remain a secret to them. It kinda reminded me about Poe and Holdo in The Last Jedi. In that movie, it felt like Holdo wasn't telling Poe the plan simply because they wanted to keep the audience in the dark. And here with Shin and Baylan, it feels the same. But besides that frustration I have, the scenes between the two I really like. As I said before, one of the more interesting aspects of these characters is that they're not Sith or Jedi, there's something else, and seeing them bond gives us an insight into the relationship that I always found to be intriguing. Moving on though, the highlight of these 2 episodes is Ezra and Sabine for me. Ezra was perfectly casted. I don't have many complaints about the live action recastings of animated characters, but the way Iman Esfandi plays Ezra is probably the best of all the adaptations of animated characters. The interactions between Sabine and Ezra were great. I'll be honest, I chuckled when Ezra is like, "So the Emperor is dead?" And Sabine responds with, "That's what they say." I wonder why Dave had Sabine respond like that. My biggest frustrations with these two episodes are not what was presented on screen, but what wasn't portrayed on screen. During my discussion of episode 4, I talked about the importance of Sabine facing the consequences of her actions, and what I feared would happen is that she would never face them. In these two episodes, Ezra is constantly asking Sabine for an update on how she got there or how they plan on leaving, but all she keeps on doing is telling him it's complicated. At first, I was hoping this would set up some reveal where Sabine would tell Ezra that she risked the start of another war to go find him. Ezra, of course, would be really bothered by this, and thus some tension would brew between the two. Even after he leaves in the finale, he doesn't know that Sabine is arguably to blame for the start of another war. I thought that could have been a really interesting character moment for Sabine if Ezra found out about the decision she made. And the same could be said with Ahsoka and Sabine. Of course, Ahsoka knows that Sabine made this decision, but she isn't mad about it at all because she's gone on this character arc where she'll always be supportive of her Padawan. Again, not something I hate, it's just a missed opportunity to have some tension between Sabine and Ahsoka. Ahsoka could be more forgiving because, again, she went on this arc, but she could have warned Sabine about the consequences she will likely face because of her decision. But I still really liked the character moments we ended up getting. I just think they could have done even more. And that's what turns a show from being just good to being great. And Ahsoka could have been great. To wrap up my discussion of these episodes, I wanted to briefly touch on Hera's story. This subplot with Hera and her conflict with the New Republic is another example of fine storytelling that could have been even better. Basically, Hera is feuding with Senator Xiono all season. Hera wants some New Republic assistance in stopping Thrawn, but the New Republic won't give her any. What I really liked about this subplot was how it ties into the sequel trilogy. What the movies did terribly is explain the state of the First Order and the Resistance. How do both exist? How are they different from the Rebellion and the Empire? Brief history lesson from the expanded lore: the New Republic was totally inept. They avoided conflict at all costs and basically allowed the First Order to rise because they didn't want to start another war. The Resistance formed because Leia was sick of the New Republic and wanted to take fighting the First Order into her own hands. Then The Force Awakens happened and the New Republic was destroyed. What these shows like Ahsoka and The Mandalorian are setting up is how incompetent the New Republic is. When watching these shows, it should be no surprise that the Empire was able to destroy the Republic so easily in a few decades. What I found so frustrating about these scenes with Hera, however, is that the New Republic has no reason not to trust Hera. She's a general, a rank that she earned and simply wasn't given. She's earned the benefit of the doubt that if she thinks the Empire is still out there, then they should listen. Xiono just appears to be a dick here simply because he wants to be a dick. There's a fine line between incompetence and incompetence solely because the plot demands it, and I feel this storyline inches towards the latter. In the beginning of the 7th episode, Hera is on trial and will potentially be court-martialed. That would have been really interesting. Hera abusing her power to get a squadron of fighters to help her and having to face the consequences of her actions would have been something I'd like to have seen. But no, at the end of it all, we get C-3PO telling the senators that Leia retroactively approved Hera's mission and Hera won't face the consequences of her actions. Similar to almost everything I've said about this season, I don't hate that decision, I just wish they could have done something so much better. And those are my thoughts on episodes 6 and 7. That leaves us with just the finale. The finale seemed to have left a lot of people unsatisfied, and at first I was confused as to why. There was nothing in particular with this finale that I found to be so offensive to some viewers. There was some pretty good action that, sure, could have been filmed better. The final fight between Ahsoka and Morgan I found to be really well done. I thought the Stormtrooper zombies were a really cool inclusion into the story. It gives us a reason in the future to fear Thrawn other than because of his tactical genius. They're going to Dathomir and probably raise some sort of army there. I already touched on Sabine using the Force already. I don't mind it at all and I found it to be well done. There are some great individual moments between the characters that highlighted how much they have changed over the season. So what was the issue? After thinking about it for a few days and even discussing it with my Tatooine friends, I came to the conclusion that most of the mixed feelings come from the final few minutes. The season ended on a cliffhanger for sure. Plot lines were left unresolved. Thrawn is clearly going to begin his campaign that will lead into the Dave Filoni movie. None of those were bad things, but I feel certain story points weren't properly paid off or were left too open-ended. Since the opening crawl, we were teased with the return of Thrawn. This Grand Admiral is such a threat that he must be stopped at all costs. All season, the plot has revolved around making sure this man does not return to the galaxy. Hera needs to tell Mon Mothma that the prospect of Thrawn's return is real and that they need to prepare for the worst. In the final few moments, Thrawn escapes and Sabine and Ahsoka don't seem to really care. They stare in disbelief for a few seconds and then gladly go back to the planet to live with the crab people. I feel the ending would have worked a lot better if there was a strong feeling of dread that surrounded the season. Like, oh shit, we failed and now we are stranded here. Fuck. But because Ahsoka has such a positive attitude, it makes us feel like Thrawn's return was not that big of a deal. And maybe this next point was simply poor expectation setting, but having Thrawn's final scene just be him hovering over Dathomir was a little anticlimactic. People speculated that we would have seen a mini battle where Thrawn just decimates some New Republic ships, and I think that would have worked. We were told to fear Thrawn's return all season, so ending the season with a reason to justify our fears would have been a good payoff, but instead we didn't get a payoff, and we're just going to have to wait until season 2. I proposed a different ending that I think could have worked better. Instead of having this epilogue where we see where all our characters ended the season, when Thrawn jumps into hyperspace, just have the camera linger on Sabine and Ahsoka in horror and then cut to black. I feel that would have emphasized that feeling of dread and would have provided the cliffhanger with a lot more emotional weight, but instead every single storyline was just left open-ended with a small tease. Sabine and Ahsoka are stranded on Peridia. Let's see what happens there. Thrawn now has some secret plans on Dathomir that has to do with zombies. Let's see what happens there. Baylan is revealed to have been looking for something related to the Mortis gods. What specifically, we don't know, so let's see what happens there. Shin is kinda just left alone and goes to these marauders. Let's see what happens there. And speaking of Shin, why didn't she just go back to Thrawn in the Empire? She had her little horsey. She could have easily made it back in time, and I don't think Thrawn would have turned her away. She's committed to his cause. So to see Shin kinda just give up and settle with these marauders was a bit confusing. But anyway, see how all the storylines in the season were kinda just left open-ended? None of them have the same weight as the cliffhanger in The Force Awakens, which was a great cliffhanger. But when I rewatched the episode and I had my expectations properly managed, I did grow to really appreciate the episode. It would be one thing if these storylines were never going to be addressed again, but we're most likely going to get a season 2. So depending on how well or how poorly season 2 continues these stories will shape how I view season 1's ending. Now, before I wrap up the discussion of the finale, I do want to discuss one more thing about Sabine and Ahsoka's arcs. So the season ends with the two closer than ever. Ahsoka is a wiser woman and Sabine has begun her journey with the Force. Both went on character arcs where they began the story flawed and they overcame their flaws. The one criticism I have for these arcs, however, is their seemingly irrelevance towards the plot. A standard character arc goes like this. A character has a flaw. Because of said flaw, the character makes a bad decision. Said bad decision drives the plot forward and creates obstacles for the character. After suffering the consequences of their actions, the character is forced to change. Once the character changes, they are now able to resolve the issue they previously could not solve. With Ahsoka's arc, her flaw has a clear impact portrayed in her strained relationship with Sabine, but that strained relationship doesn't really affect the plot. You could argue that if there wasn't so much tension between the two, Sabine wouldn't have taken the map away in the first episode and then lost it. Sure, but I think what Dave was really going for was with Sabine giving Baylan the map. Ahsoka tells Huyang that she hadn't properly trained Sabine to make the right decision and destroy the map. I fundamentally disagree with this premise. Sabine is a grown woman who made her own decision to risk the galaxy to find one of the only people she still considers family. Was Ahsoka's hypothetical proper training to make sure Sabine removes attachment from those she cares about the most? That doesn't seem like the right thing to do. I reject the notion that Sabine's decisions stem from a character flaw. Sure, it was selfish, but it was a human decision and one I totally understand. Now, you could argue that her being selfish is the flaw, but that's not the flaw I think the narrative is trying to get her to overcome. At the end of the season, Ahsoka gives me the vibe that she doesn't have any issue with Sabine's decision. In fact, she's proud of Sabine for getting Ezra home. So if I were to do a hypothetical rewrite, I would have had Ahsoka and Sabine's flaws have more dire consequences on the plot of the season. But again, even without it, I still enjoyed the last episode. I know I said before that was the last thing, but I do want to touch on one more thing that I feel a lot of people seem to be confused about, and that's Thrawn's plan. People say at the end of the season that he should have destroyed the tower, or he should have moved the Star Destroyer higher into orbit. I get those criticisms, choices. But you guys need to listen carefully to what Thrawn said in episode 7. If she's anything like her master, she will be unpredictable and quite dangerous, which is why we must control all variables. Put her on a path of our own choosing so that no matter which direction she takes, we'll always be one step ahead of her. Like her master, Ahsoka will be unpredictable and dangerous. Thrawn has to make sure that he limits all possibilities of Ahsoka doing something unpredictable. This is why he wanted Ahsoka to take the easy path, or the path of least resistance, right up the tower. Remember what happened the last time Thrawn was defeated. He was sitting above the Imperial Dome on Lothal with his cruisers ready to destroy the city. Then out of the blue, a bunch of space whales appeared from the sky and took him to another galaxy for a decade. Thrawn knows the Jedi are better at improvising than almost anyone, and he knows Anakin Skywalker was exceptional at that. If Thrawn were to destroy the tower or make some other concerted effort to defeat Ahsoka, for all he knows, they could summon space whales again, or summon something else that Thrawn could have never seen coming. Thrawn wants Ahsoka to go down a path where she can't do something like summoning space whales, and that path is for him to lay a trap right up the tower. Thrawn was able to escape because he never allowed Ahsoka or Ezra to be in a position to do something unpredictable, and frankly, he couldn't even prevent everything unpredictable from happening because Sabine used the Force to get Ezra on the ship, something he couldn't have known would have happened. I frankly thought that was a brilliant decision from Thrawn, and one perfectly fitting for his character. So that was another reason that I quite enjoyed the episode. It felt like Star Wars to me, and even though I clearly acknowledge the many issues this episode and the season had, I can't help but smile watching it. So, Ahsoka was almost great. Even with all the issues I had with the season, I do think the season overall is a win for the Star Wars brand. A lot of people like to say that not everything in Star Wars needs to be connecting, that not every show needs to be connected to other shows or the animated shows or the books or the movies. And while I totally agree with this premise that not everything needs to be connected, some things should be allowed to be connected. Andor is its own thing that only connects to Rogue One. The Acolyte is coming out next year, and that's most likely going to be its own thing. What I like about the current state of the Star Wars franchise is that it's finally taking advantage of the long timeline in its canon. Star Wars is using the Mandoverse to tell a more MCU-esque story where a bunch of different projects connect with each other to tell a wider narrative that will ultimately lead into a climactic event. I don't mind this at all because, again, there are plenty of other projects that Star Wars is also focusing on. Of the 3 new movies announced, one takes place in the Mandoverse, one takes place in the future with Rey, and one takes place in the far distant past with the start of the Jedi. A lot of people have this belief that if not everything is good, that means the brand is failing. I vehemently disagree with this because there's something for everyone. If you don't like the MCU style storytelling with the Mandoverse, you have Andor and some of the other shows. Star Wars finally has something for everyone. Even the strongest Disney Star Wars haters like Andor, so there's even something for them. I'm excited about the future of Star Wars, and I'm excited for the future of the Mandoverse because that era has direction. After the book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian Season 3, I really feel that era was losing viewers' interest, but Ahsoka gives people an ongoing plotline to look forward to. Even though the shows are far from perfect, and I think Ahsoka was a heavily flawed season of Disney+, these are exciting times for me as a Star Wars fan, and I'm sorry if you don't feel the same. Those are all the reasons why Ahsoka just fell short of greatness, but was still a pretty enjoyable show. What did you guys think? Was Ahsoka great? Was it terrible? Or was it somewhere in the middle like I believe? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.